there's this kind of inequality of bargaining power that employees have. I signed up because I need a job and I need an income. That fundamental kind of inequality in the relationship whereby if I say, hey, do you have capacity to do this? They're more likely to say yes than no and take on more work. So I do agree that being upfront is really important. And I think that as you become sort of more experienced, you'll understand more about the kind of cultures you want to work in.
Welcome to the Burnout Detox Kit Podcast. I'm your host, Sophie Theen. I'm an award-winning people and culture executive, keynote speaker, coach, and the founder of the Burnout Detox Project. For more than a decade, I help companies build high-performing teams and cultures across fast-growing businesses. But behind the scenes, I was burning out over and over again. So I saw the side of success nobody talks about openly. So each week, I bring you raw conversations, expert insights that will help you navigate your toxic workplace and finally understand what success should never demand from you. So if you press play today, it means some part of you is ready for that to change. Welcome, and let's get into today's episode. Well, welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Ollie, who is a former student leader turned educator and the founder of Alchemy. Now, Ollie's relationship with burnout starts at the very early in his career and has basically shaped the way he thinks about work, culture, and mental health altogether. As listeners know, I also burnt out in a previous consulting role, which then prompted me to start this show. And in this episode, we are going to explore toxic work cultures, how they can become our norm, why suppressing burnout is dangerous, and what it takes to actually build healthier workplaces for both students, staff, from both of our perspectives. So welcome, Ollie. Great to have you here on the show today.
Sophie, thank you for having me and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I love to talk about organisational culture and burnout, so I'm really happy.
Amazing. So just to kick us off, the first thing that I remember you talked about was how your first professional role, even as a student union sabbatical officer, has introduced you to burnout at such a young age, very early on in your career. So what does that look like when you've pretty much had nothing else to fall back onto and this is a completely new concept that you are feeling?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, a very early introduction in my career to burnout. So prior to university, I'd only had part-time jobs. So I hadn't really been fully invested in, I guess, a company's culture. I'd go and do my shift and leave. And then at the back end of my university career, I ran in an election or in two elections, once to be a vice president of the Students' Union and another time to be president. And I won both of them. So for me, I went into my first professional role as very much kind of the idea that, for example, people would wear how many days leave they still have to take as a badge, as a badge of honor sort of thing. Or, it would be about overworking or how many hours have you done? So I just got put into this culture where the stakes were quite high. Particularly my second year as president, because I was also the chair of the board of the, this is a multi-million pound charity, essentially. So I found very quickly that my health started to deteriorate. I gained a lot of weight. I was often feeling quite depressed. I even tried to get counselling in my second year and through the occupational health of the university, and I actually didn't have time to attend counselling. I was prioritising other work things above that.
I mean, it's really difficult to hear you say, all the things that was happening to you and all the overwhelming feeling that you were feeling at that time. But all in all, you were putting everything else first before yourself. I'm sure you've gone into that line of work because you're passionate about the situation and you're passionate about, helping others, especially in that space. But at the same time, as you said, sometimes we don't get to choose the environment we operate in. And I imagine that was one of the reasons why you've started Alchemy. So coming on to that, it took me years for myself to realize that the startup grind that I was in for over a decade wasn't the only way to work. You were absolutely right. I resonated with what you were saying about celebrating how many hours you pull in a day and celebrating how little sleep you actually need to
Yes.
operate or function as a human being. And many of us internalize our first workplace as well as this is the way things are done because, you see your colleagues going through the same thing. And if it's the first time you're in a work environment, you must be thinking, well, if they're achieving it via this method, then it should apply to me. So how did that early experience influence your expectations of the workplace?
Well, I think I moved out. I moved out of that role, and I wanted to stay in higher education, and I wanted to stay working with sabbatical officers. But that, it wasn't a 360 overnight. It took years to see that actually there's probably some trauma there actually that I need to deal with in terms of my own behavior, in terms of the impact the culture had on me. So I think it's kind of, you look back now and you can see it very clearly. At the time, probably didn't have one sort of moment of clarity. It was more about kind of the more you read, the more you invest in yourself, the more you kind of realize, and also, you're looking at yourself and how you were. And I think moving into different roles, I did take bad habits into them. And I still do have bad habits. And I think the key thing is as you grow up and you kind of go through your career is trying to develop that self-awareness to be able to check in with yourself and to be able to say no to certain cultures. So, it's very hard, isn't it? When you're kind of looking at a job pack, you can't tell the culture until you're there, until you're employed by that organization. And I think it's necessary to experience sometimes some cultures that aren't for you. So, in the future, and you can try your best while you're going for other roles to try and identify what their culture is like. To try to choose the best sort of space for you to thrive at work.
I love the way you explain that in a way that you've built resilience and you've obviously grown through all of the experiences. And it's true that over the years, we have seen lots of changes, especially when it comes to expecting the type of cultures for a workplace and what type of environment that is suitable for you. I remember about 7-8 years ago, I was working for this very, very fast-paced, hyper-growth company, and I was part of employer branding. So I was the head of talent there. And we had a very unapologetic culture. And we basically have 3 things on the wall, as we always see. This was back in the days. We had 3 things on the wall. One was never settle, one was hustle culture, and the other is basically, we do go around and celebrate. Success doesn't come easy. But because we were so unapologetic about the culture that we were building and that we believe it's the core principles of our success, every time I went out and interviewed people, I was very upfront and honest about it. Now, it may feel like 7 years ago, it's very abrasive for a recruiter to sit in front of you, say, Ollie, you're interviewing, I'm sitting in front of you, and I said, look, these are the 3 things we expect from our talent. And it's totally up to you whether or not this works for you. And I remember at that time, we had a lot of negative connotation around it because we were honest about our culture. On the other hand, everyone else, including all the founders or the CEOs I'm sure you've seen, come up on stage and sugarcoat their own culture.
Yes.
And that's when it backfires, right? So we were punished at that time for being utterly honest about what we believe works for us. 7 years later, the company is celebrated as one of the most successful companies. And that's the thing, right? You have to be honest about the culture you want to operate in for yourself. Like you said, doing the work for your self-awareness. But at the same time, you also hope to meet an employer that is honest about what they're trying to build.
That's absolutely right. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think being upfront and honest is really important. But absolutely, you have to know what that culture looks like for you. And you have to understand that if someone is being upfront and honest, that, you might have to walk away. But I think one of the things and the problem that we have in workplaces is there's a lack or there's an imbalance of bargaining power. If you're looking for a job, you're always told in interviews to say yes to whatever they say you can do. And you're thinking to yourself, well, I have to accept that because they will be my employer. And so there's this kind of inequality of bargaining power that employees have when they go into a place that ultimately they want a paycheck. And I'm not saying that cynically. I'm saying that because they need that to pay the rent, to pay their mortgage. And that, and I think that is the big issue. And when I became an employer, it's something that I hadn't thought of. I thought if I was going to be I would be the most progressive employer, manager, whatever. But there were always that fundamental kind of inequality in the relationship whereby if I say, hey, do you have capacity to do this? They're more likely to say yes than no and take on more work. Even though I want them to push back, I don't think you're always going to get true, authentic honesty at the point where you're joining an organization. And that's where I think the honeymoon period starts. And then the realization comes in afterwards, actually, this isn't a place for me, or it is. Sometimes it is. It's oh, I didn't realize this. This is great. And people have long careers in those kind of companies because it's what they need and what they want.
Yeah, I love how you position that. Sometimes we don't have a choice. And that's where, as you said, the honeymoon period comes in. You get to kind of do the tango a little bit together, whether or not there are some things that maybe you didn't expect in the first place, but you end up having to accommodate, or you learn to accommodate because you actually didn't think that it was that bad. So I totally agree with you that true alignment does not necessarily means forever success when you go and join a workplace. So let's talk about our physical impact when it comes to burnout. And I know you've got a lot of experience in this as well. I remember the times where I was ignoring every red flag that my body was telling me. This isn't about the circumstances or how people were treating me. It was literally my body was taking over. I had sleepless nights, constant adrenaline that I just thought were part of being normal. As a high performer, you're supposed to feel a certain way. I remember when we were speaking, you spoke about suppressing burnout and then believing that being constantly stretched is actually normal. Coming back to your personal experience, what were the kind of normal signs that you were feeling?
It's a really good question. I think I'll firstly say that I'm not very good at picking up signs from my body. And I think that's because I've got ADHD. And so my mind just goes a million miles a minute and I really don't pay enough attention to my body as it is. So when I do get a good night's sleep and I still feel exhausted, I think for me, that is one of the signs of burnout. That's the first stage for me. It's noticing it. And the second stage is kind of processing that as well. It's a strange one. And I think that through neurodivergence, burnout kind of interacts differently with the way your brain works. And I think just being present with your body and being able to assign those kind of different types of rest.
And just out of curiosity, did you, just based on the experience that you've gone through, did you learn this? Did you learn the need for rest and for reset or pause based on the experience that you've gone through?
Yeah, I did. There was a time when I was in my 80s, I lost both my parents, and there's work stories attached to both of them. The first one was my mum, and I saw her at the Christmas time, and she passed away in the April, and I wasn't that far away in the UK. I was in Nottingham. She was in sort of Yorkshire area. And I kept on putting off going to visit just because I thought that I had a lot of work on. And I gave that work to myself. That wasn't the organization saying that. And so the story there was that, I didn't get to see my mum before she passed away. And she passed away in the Easter, sort of the April time. And it was just one of those things where, I was sort of, wasn't thinking it at the time, but essentially, am I saying that work is more important than my relationship with my mum and keeping up with my mum? I wasn't to know what was going to happen. I'm not too harsh on myself now, but I just think, don't put work ahead of your relationships because they're not going to always be there forever. And then I lost my dad about 20 months later. And I remember going back into work because what had worked what I thought had worked was just throwing myself into my work after I lost my mum. And then after I lost my dad, I did the same thing. But my role had changed and I'd suddenly become a manager of around sort of 6 or 7 people. Whereas prior to that, I was just becoming an emerging manager and I'd picked up a couple of roles that I was managing and it wasn't sort of too much on the mental load. But I remember going back and it just being very different because actually I owed my team my best and I wasn't at my best. I was very short with them. I just continually remember feeling very tired, very kind of irritated, dysregulated when they would ask questions, which looking back, they were they were really easy questions to answer if you kind of had your head screwed on, and you were looking after yourself. Reading as much as I could on leadership and organizational development and organizational culture, vulnerability, authenticity, emotional intelligence, all of these things that are now very much kind of people are talking about. And even now, you still have to take that time. I'm not amazing at it. I'm not like the finished article by any stretch of the imagination, but you will have bad times, but you have to have that rest. So today, for example, it wasn't my day to get up and take the girls to school on the school run. So I actually and I knew I had this at 11 o'clock, but I actually had a lie until about sort of 9:30. And I knew I needed that rest. Otherwise I would come here and I would just feel very tired and probably giving you one word answers on the podcast, which wouldn't be very entertaining at all. So yeah, rest is really important. And I think you need to know when you need to rest, and the people around you need to sort of take that seriously when you kind of disclose that to them.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm also really glad to hear that you had the opportunity, and obviously you had a understanding manager or even organization to actually allow you to take that time off. Because as you said, you can only learn from your own experiences. And I can only imagine, even up until today, as you said, you've integrated rest as part of your principles of being able to keep going, or be in your best form as part of your lifestyle.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes with the privilege of being your own boss as well. But a lot of people who go into being their own boss don't necessarily take that on board. They will take whatever toxic behaviors they've got from the work world and then enable them and bring them into kind of their own business.
Of course. So coming back to that, I started this podcast after my own experience of burnout. I want to know your mission. What gave you the drive to focus on student well-being and self-care now?
Yeah, I guess it's my own experiences. I've shared quite a few today. But yeah, it's my own kind of experiences around really knowing what it feels like to be burnt out. Knowing what it's like to pull back from the brink as well, or to recognize it and stop yourself going there. So now a lot of the work I do is with people who work in students' unions, sometimes officers or staff, and people on the wellbeing side of things in higher education. And I do talk about burnout and overwork a lot. It underpins actually why we exist as a company is because we want to offer accessible capacity. Because one of the massive issues in higher education, if you want capacity, you have to pay for it. If you want to pay for it, you've got all these add-on costs. And there's a lot of well-meaning institutions and students' unions out there who want to do a lot of work based on the passion that they have for the student experience, and who are also very mature in kind of how they set that up, but they just don't get the funding that they need to do that. And so you'll find that people overwork. And our job is to say, okay, we can provide you with that capacity and it won't cost you as much as it will cost to hire a person. And we do that because we want to allay the kind of overwork culture that can come in, particularly when you're working towards a social purpose. It's often like if you work in a charity, it's often like it's expected because you work for that purpose. In another way, I'm quite kind of grateful for it as well, weirdly, because it has shaped kind of who I am and what I get to do now in my career. So there's two sides to it, really, isn't there? Really,
of course. Yeah. As we always say. Now, Ollie, obviously, to close, I always ask this question so that listeners can have some practical takeaways. Beyond knowing your limits, you were talking about boundaries. What's the golden advice you would share?
Yeah, so golden bit of advice. I guess for me, I think when you're starting off in your career, it's really important that you develop your self-awareness, how much you can take on. What does burnout feel like to you? How do you know that you're approaching it? What is the right culture for you? And then employers need to understand what I said towards the beginning about this inequality of bargaining power when it comes to actually joining and signing up to a culture.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ollie, for your incredible advice to all sorts of people out there you don't necessarily need to be feeling like you're in the middle of burnout to actually be learning from this. As you said, self-awareness is the foundation.
Absolutely. No. And thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been really good to do more reflection in terms of how I feel about these issues and where they're going to. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ollie, for the time that you have spent with us today. And anyone else out there listening, feel free to reach out to Ollie if you have further questions or anything that sparks your interest. If this episode resonated with you today, make sure to follow and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a conversation as important as this. The Burnout Detox Kit is here to make sure ambitious people like you recover from the burnout without losing themselves in the process. So if you know someone navigating burnout right now, workplace toxicity, even simply trying to hold it all together, share this episode with them. You never know who might need to hear it. I thank you for your courage today and thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next episode.